together to launch this series of, for want of a better word, what I would call conversations on a topic of what I think is great contemporary relevance. And that topic is the rise of a new form of an agency of the state that we popularly call regulator, but what I would more, being a lawyer, precisely call an SRA, or a statutory regulatory authority. I'll come presently to the details of that, but before I do that, let me first, on behalf of all our institutions and FOIA, welcome you, Madam Rita Tewatia, Chairperson of the Food Standards Safety Authority of India. Madam is a IAS officer of the Gujarat cadre who spent many years in the state government, Government of India, in very many different departments. The last position that she held in Government of India was Commerce Secretary, Government of India, and she's been chairperson of FSSAI for the last 3 years, or nearly 3 years. As I mentioned, ma'am, a warm welcome to you from all of us. I also welcome my colleagues who are here with me, and I'll get to them when I conclude my bit. And I also take this opportunity to welcome you all, the audience, to this evening's conversation. Ma'am, why KYR? Why do we need a Know Your Regulator series? Very simply, and sitting where you are right now, you will know, regulators now touch our lives in a million ways, in more ways than we recognize. Taking FSSAI, clearly, this is an organization that perhaps touches nearly all Indians. Because I think almost, I can say axiomatically, anyone who consumes food is perhaps touched by what is done in this room and in this agency. Likewise, we discovered, I'm sure, during the last 1.5 years, an agency which most of us didn't know existed, called the Drug Controller, and nuances of how our medicines approved, how our vaccines approved. I can go further. Insurance. Most of us don't even stop for a minute when we are sort of buying a car, getting into an aeroplane. The insurance that we buy is a product regulated by the Insurance Regulatory Development Authority of India. And of course, in a sense, the mother of all, or the father of all regulators, since there has never been a lady governor, the Reserve Bank of India, perhaps like the FSSAI, in a way touches almost all Indians. So clearly, this is an agency or a form of agency that touches all our lives in very many different ways. That alone would not have been reason enough for us to have a conversation. Clearly, regulators are different from government departments. There was a time when they were not. Very many government departments themselves were regulators, and I think we've all been, ma'am, in positions where we have worked in government departments, sitting as deputy secretaries, joint secretaries, working actually like what we in the modern day call regulators. For instance, there used to be, I'm sure you recall, ma'am, controller of capital issues in the abolished in the 1990s, early 1990s. That position used to be exactly what the SEBI does today, regulate markets, but that entity or that person, the joint secretary in that case, was sitting inside a government department. Now, increasingly, however, these are becoming distinct and separate organizations, like for instance, the FSSAI, where we are now. And hence, my preference for the word SRA, statutory, because you are established by a law of the parliament, regulatory, in terms of the activity that you do, and authority, because you are a distinct legal persona, separate from the ministries and the departments of Government of India. What is striking about this SRA, particularly for us lawyers like Abha and me, is the fact that in reality, most regulators are actually, to quote the sort of parallel from Hindu mythology, you are Trimurtis. You are, unlike other standard organizations, the state, you have powers to legislate, you have powers to implement the legislation. Very often, most regulators also have powers to preside over disputes on the very regulations that you write. It may not be the case with every regulator. The design varies from activity to activity, but almost all regulators will at least have two of the three functions. And the financial sector regulators, for instance, RBI, SEBI, IRDA, PFRDA, or the Insolvency Bankruptcy Board of India, most of them, at least in some aspects, have all three powers. They write legislation, they enforce the legislation, and they adjudicate on disputes. And I use the word legislation to broadly include administrative law. That is law not made by legislature, but law made by subordinate bodies. Now, why do you need an SRA? You surely, sitting in SRA, in an SRA like FSSAI, would have realized, ma'am, the situation very often is very technically complex. Very often, it may require a quick response. More important, the situation that you deal with on a continuing basis varies so much, the dynamism in the sector or in the activity is so much that a detailed parliamentary legislation cannot envisage even 1 year ahead what lies. And hence, the need to give flexibility to an organization to be able to write legislation as the situation demands. Equally important, and this is in the literature sort of very well documented, arm's length from politics. For instance, if you have to bring out an initial public offer, make shares available to the general public, SEBI has disclosure norms. What is it that the company which wants to raise money from the public should disclose to the public which should be investing? Now, that clearly is a technical public interest, consumer interest related call, and ordinarily does not have any serious political content. It may have political implications, but it doesn't have political content. So the way this theory has developed in the literature is you need quick, dynamic, technical decision making. You need a bit of distance from politics because you want to give certainty to the market. You don't want this to get caught in political disputes. But on the other hand, conferring these kinds of huge powers on one agency could raise serious issues of democratic deficit, accountability, etc., etc. And hence, I think there is need to reach out to the larger public. It could be students, it could be just plain and simple consumers of food, consumers of medicine, journalists who cover these topics, researchers, SRA staff. So the idea was we could have a public awareness kind of conversation, not a very casual conversation, but not a very technical conversation, a conversation which makes sense to the intelligent layperson. And just to give you a background, man, we had a curtain raiser, which is a month ago, where we introduced the idea with the outgoing chairperson of IBBI, Dr. MS Sahu, who's been in the regulatory field for a long time. Today is the first full-fledged conversation with a regulator. So I'm happy, ma'am, that we are with you, a regulator who, as I said, touches perhaps all Indians, and in a sense, your sisters and brothers touch the entire world. The global community of FSSAs would perhaps be touching the whole world. The way we decided to do this conversation is we spend a little bit of time on the domain, food safety standards, And we spend a little bit of time on the larger idea of SRA. You've been in government, you've seen the inside, you know what it means to be responsible to Parliament, which is an important part of the Indian Constitution. But you also know what is it that is needed for flexibility in an organization like the FSSAI. So the entire gamut of SRA-related issues, time permitting. My team, you've met them briefly, ma'am. Mekhala is a senior researcher in the CPR, leading a large project on state capacity and regulation. Otherwise, a very, very highly qualified anthropologist who is a teacher, very well trained in India and abroad. Abha Yadav is a professor at the Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs, a trained lawyer, formerly born on the strength of JNU, currently on secondment to IICI, and leading this effort on the FOIR IICA collaboration on regulators. And we've been supported all along through by a team in CPR led by Arkaja Singh, my team in NCAR led by Sundus, Sudipto, Amrita Pillai. And I also want to place before you, ma'am, the strong encouragement that we've received from FOIR, Dr. Sahu in particular, our respective DGs, Yamini and Poonam. And with this very not brief introduction, I will now hand over to Mekhala and Abha for the next set of questions. I understand, Abha, you will lead the conversation. If I've been very formal, it's now up to you to make it less formal, less stiff, and make it more conversation. Thank you, and thanks, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Krishnan. And I think you really set the stage for a very, very interesting conversation. And ma'am, we welcome you again. And it's absolutely a joy to be in your office in this wonderful ambience. And thank you for letting us in. So like Dr. Krishnan said, let us begin. I think it will be very interesting for our audience here to talk about and to discuss about the constitution of FSSAI. Because as we all know that this organization, this particular regulator is fairly young, if I may say so. And it was established under the Food Safety and Standards Act of 2006. And the primary aim of which was to keep a check on the ever-growing problem of food adulteration, which our country faces from time to time. And I think nobody is untouched from that. And I think FSSAI has done some groundbreaking work in that respect. What is unique, I feel, about the FSS Act is that it is a melting pot, sort of, because a few other acts were brought in, Milk Act and the Adulteration Act and Vegetable Oil and Control Order and all of that. So it is under one umbrella that now we have the FSS Act under which this particular regulator was set up. Now, I'm only trying to contextualize the issue, and then we'll move on to the foundational challenges which you can share with us. Do we have any foundational challenges? We as researchers, maybe from a distance, do see some, but it would be lovely to hear from you if they actually exist. So, like I said earlier, that there is a consolidation of multiple laws that there were in the country relating to food safety. And now, as FSSAI, we have established a single point reference system to address all of those problems. So, to begin with, do you think that FSSAI has some foundational issues, challenges? Would you like to tell us more about its constitution?
Look, this particular legislation was born in response, as you very rightly mentioned, to the fact that although in 1954, we decided as a country we'd had enough of multiple regulations, state level, sub-state level, all kinds of regulations. But we decided we'd have a single comprehensive legislation. That was actually the Prevention of Food Adulteration Act, 1954, and enforced 1955. But that didn't last even a year, because in the same year, the Essential Commodities Act came in, 55, and these multiple orders, the Edible Oil Control Order, the Milk Products Order, the infant food control order, meat products, all this. There was a large number of them. What happened was all of these were being implemented by a lot of different ministries. And so again, it became a situation where industry, consumers were all terribly confused because there were overlapping jurisdictions. And it was in response to this actually that in 98, the Prime Minister's Council on Trade and Industry said we need a modern, comprehensive legislation which will do all the functions that we wish to see instead of all this piecemeal approach. And that's what led to the formation of the Food Safety and Standards Act in 2006. And born out of that act, the constitution of this authority, the Food Safety Authority, in 2008. So if you ask me the challenges, how did this body get its first teams together? They were all the old guys who came from PFA, some of these old existing bodies. And what we ended up with really were people who brought their history here. So we had a modern piece of legislation. We wanted to be looking less at enforcement, but more at conformity assessment. But we had a certain culture. So that was something that we really had to unlearn as an organization, to create a brand new culture and to look at, in a way, at much more of self-compliance, much more of conformity assessment, and processes rather than absolute standards. So it was completely a cultural shift for us. I believe that that's one of the big challenges which we have somehow grappled with and I think come out of. The other issue has been, and I will continue to talk about this, is uneven state capacity. This is a federal act. It expects that the implementation, enforcement of regulation will be a joint responsibility of the center and states. Now, in a situation like this, you asked me, we touch the lives of every single Indian every single day. It's true. But is the level of my enforcement and compliance uniform throughout the country? Is the level of competency and skill set uniform? Then we have a challenge there. And that is something that we are dealing with, we are grappling with, and perhaps that's something we'll discuss as we move along. But I consider this also a fundamental challenge.
If I may interject.
Sorry to interrupt. Interesting, just as a 10-minute, 10-second intersection, when the SEBI Act was passed in 92, an explicit decision was taken. None of the controller of capital issues people should go into SEBI because we are moving away from control to regulation. So create a brand new organization. 2, do not keep it in Delhi. The Delhi, and this is explicit, it's interesting, in the files of the Ministry of Finance, handwritten notes of the then hierarchy, Dr. Y.V. Reddy, G.V. Ramakrishna, who became the first chairperson, that I would like to be in Bombay to not have anything to do with existing teams, exactly for, I'm struck by what you said. So it's interesting for our research.
But we have moved from there.
Yeah,
So
true.
let's say that.
True, but comparative sort of picture.
Yeah.
So I think the thought that I had done was, you talked about center, state, and the roles that different, you have to work with the state sort of, and food is a confidence-less subject. Now talking about autonomy of FSSAI here, I mean, you are the regulator for food, and like Dr. Krishnan said, and we all know that you touch upon the lives of every individual, be it an agriculturist and retailer and industrialist, the common man, the common woman. Now, but you have your own internal workings that you have to sort out. There are staffing issues, there are short staffing issues. Then there are pay scale issues, finance-related issues, HR issues, both at the central and state level. So would I be wrong to classify those as foundational challenges, or
Look, very early on, we adopted the government, broadly the government pay scales, but we compressed the levels a little bit. So we have a much leaner structure. That's one thing that we did. The second is we started out with a sanction strength of 356 people for this organization. And slowly the deputationists who had come at the initial phase, naturally they retired, they went away, etc. And we started our own process of finding people, most of whom came in originally on contract. It took us till 2018 to actually write our recruitment rules and get them passed. And at the same time, we got an additional complement of positions approved. So the first round of recruitments we've really done as an authority with proper recruitment rules and getting in the qualified, people as per that, was 2019. We are now 550 strong, but our strength is 842 or so. And all that recruitment is now currently underway. So we are getting, it's amazing. I thought that we would have a challenge in getting the right talent, but the amount of bright, qualified food technologists, master's degrees, etc., all interested in this authority, we had a very tough competition, and I think we have got some really good people in. So I'm very hopeful and optimistic on this particular aspect of how the teams are coming together within the Food Safety Authority.
Very heartening to hear, ma'am. And before I hand over to Meghla with the next bracket of questions or thoughts that she may have, one last issue again, drawing from what Dr. Krishnan said about a regulator, and this is a very general issue, not just pertaining to FSSAI, that a regulator is really a free movement. So a regulator is established because the government feels that a particular area needs regulation. Not really with the government, not really with the parliament, of course accountable to the parliament, but and not really the government, above the ministry, shall I say so, dare I say so. But the point is that what do you think of this scheme of things of having all three powers, the executive, legislative and judicial powers, with a regulator, any regulator?
To say any regulator, then I would certainly say the judicial part of it should not be there. I do think that should stand apart from the actual. As far as we are concerned in the Food Authority, we don't actually do all of the enforcement ourselves. In terms of the dispute resolution, some part of it we do. See, our let me say, failures of food products, when we test a sample, there can be a labeling deficiency. We attempt that labeling deficiencies are not going to harm the food. They are technical deficiencies. These, what we now propose in the amendment to the Act, is to be compounded by the designated officers or the FSOs itself. So this gets settled with a fine, and yes, there we do decide. But the fine quantum and etc., the extent of the defect are very clearly defined. The second comes the quality issues. The milk, say, does not contain enough fat. Somebody's diluted it with water or whatever. But it's not harmful to health. So it's a quality issue, it's not a safety issue. Such issues go first to our adjudicating officers, who are usually additional district magistrates outside of the Food Safety Administration. And from there it goes to
jurisdictional ADMs in states.
Or states have taken different patterns. Some have taken STM, some have taken their joint commissioners, but it is somebody who is not involved with the day-to-day administration of the Act. And the appeals from that lie to an appellate body that is constituted in each state and normally headed by a retired judge of the High Court. Now, criminal cases are the ones where there is a safety issue. And if there is a safety issue, then these cases go first to the lower criminal court in the district, and then, of course, in appeal in the normal hierarchy. So we really have three categories of offenses and three different ways in which they are dealt with.
Again, a very interesting, it's a point for us to come back to her later and more important to ponder over.
Yes.
A very nuanced hierarchy of quasi-judicial matters and what needs to be done by who, depending on the core as opposed to relatively less core to the ultimate objective of the act.
See what happens then, and I think it's important to note that for minor, for infringements which do not affect quality and safety, the compounding is easily resolved. If it was not easily resolved, and today it is still a problem because it still goes to a adjudicating officer and then the appellate body, is they never get disposed. You can deal with it through an improvement notice, you can deal with it through a fine. There are many ways of dealing with it when you are able to, the DO can handle it. So I think that this is very important because in food, a solution and the penalty for an infringement must be immediate. It has no meaning after 5 years and 10 years. So this becomes a real challenge for us. I think.
The temporality is so critical in
Indeed.
these different
Indeed.
kinds of regulations. Before we actually get into the process of regulation making, which I think and standard setting, just one other foundational question is also, we've talked about center state, but also there are multiple ministries. From the inception of, the act coming out, new ministry is being formed with food processing, there's environment, there's health, very crucially. So just a reflection on, I think when we speak further, we will discuss some of the coordination challenges that FSSAI has to face in its day-to-day work on the ground with all of these multiple entities. But foundationally, as you think about the structure and its relationships to ministries, is there something that we should be aware of when we think about?
You see, if you look at the constitution of the authority itself, it provides a seat to 7 different ministries. We have health, we have food processing, we have agriculture, we have legislative affairs, we have consumer affairs. So all the key ministries are already sitting on the authority on the decision making, commerce platform.
Yeah.
So they do have a voice there. And I think in an ideal world, this is where the coordination and the, if I may say, the policy input should happen. It does not always happen, you're right. But the design is such that this should be the place where those inputs must be brought on the table. So I would say that's fair. The second thing is that another way in which a voice is given to other stakeholders, and this is the ministries included, is every single regulation of ours is put out there for a comment for 60 days. Anybody has a chance to say that I have this problem with it, or these are the technical issues, these are the actually jurisdictional or administrative issues, or public policy objectives which are being contradicted. So that opportunity exists for the global audience, it exists for our ministries, but it also exists for scientists and the common consumers as well.
I think what you're raising is a really interesting architectural point about regulatory authorities, that actually within the institution itself is the opportunity for different voices to be heard in the process of crafting the regulations. And that's important because sometimes if we don't strengthen the internal architecture, then these get done outside. When it should be actually, you should be competent and capable within the architecture of doing it inside. And it doesn't always happen, but at least in the,
But I'd also say, it's not just ministries. I mean, the industry bodies,
Yeah.
the consumer organizations, the farmer organizations, MSMEs, these are all stakeholders in our system.
yes,
They're part of our authority,
yes,
and they must be.
yes.
They must be. So I think that there is a clear recognition that these multiple stakeholders must have a seat at the table.
Yes.
They must have a voice here.
And, and interesting, just one final constitutional issue. I think it was our colleagues at NCAR who noticed that it says that a third of members must be women. This is one authority which hasn't, we've kind of reversed the balance in this conversation, thankfully. But it is, it's an interesting feature that is there. There is a CEO and a chairperson. So there are some changes in the structure, which is interesting. I don't know whether there is a backhistory to the 1/3 women in this case for food safety. Was there some thinking around it, or that you're aware of or not? But it's interesting that it is one authority which has this.
It's interesting, it's rather nice.
Yeah.
But
Then it
but,
should, yeah.
I would say yes, logical, but practically tough. The first authority had 6 women. The second had only 5. And it's a hit and miss because sometimes the representative of the ministry could be a woman. Sometimes the representative of industry could be a woman, but no guarantees. So this becomes a challenge, I think. And the difficulty arises only because there aren't enough women actually in the right leadership positions to be appointed. But there has been a conscious effort. I don't think we ever achieved 1/3, but a conscious effort was made, and I'd say a strong and brave effort as well.
Yeah. No, that's great. So just, I think you already laid out the fact that there are so many stakeholders. And, my own doctoral work, the first research that I did was in grain markets. And there between farmers, traders, processors, in the mandi, you see the importance of standards in the everyday life of anybody involved from production to consumption. So obviously standard setting and regulatory work and developing these regulations is the critical work here. And it is a vital and contested space, and it's very complex. It requires both technical competence and technical consideration, but a whole range of administrative questions and other negotiations. And it is a space of balance. So I thought if you could take us through in the next few minutes the process of standard setting and regulation. Perhaps even beginning with the question of when do you decide that a regulation or a standard is required, because this is such a fast evolving space. We were discussing whether almond milk is milk, and do you have to say something about it? So how does it come up to that point where you say, okay, we actually now do need a standard here?
Yeah, so, it's provoked by different issues. We've created a network of institutions called NETSCO-PAN, which is the network of scientific institutions working in food safety and nutrition. There's about 45 research and academic institutions that are part of this network. We've grouped them into 8 groupings, which is, foods of plant origin, foods of animal origin, biological, chemical, safe and sustainable packaging, things like that, 8 groupings. They do for us some horizon scanning. They also identify emerging research trends, emerging new products, and bring some of this to the table. Apart from this, our scientific community itself and stakeholders bring emerging new products to attention, new technological processes, new technologies in food, new additives and emerging risks in terms of contaminants and things like that. Any one of these could provoke a new standard or an amendment to an existing standard. So when it starts there, What happens is we work through a system, and now I should talk about the structure of the organization, because apart from chairman and CEO and authority, we have a scientific committee. We have scientific panels. Scientific panels, we have a total of 21, all subject specialists, each one comprising 11 independent scientists or experts. So about you can imagine about 230 scientists are involved in the standard setting process altogether across these 21 panels. So it gets allotted, any job like that gets allotted to the relevant panel, whatever the subject of that may be. That panel works on the particular standard. They look at the risk assessment, they look at the data. They may set up an expert group if something extra has to be done, and they will develop a standard. Once they have done that, it goes to the scientific committee, which actually comprises the chairpersons of all the scientific panels, as well as 6 independent experts. So this body actually is to look at the cross-cutting issues across panels. What are the wider implications? And then once they're through, they accept a standard with modification, whatever, it goes to the authority. From the authority, it is approved only as a draft. And here is where the inputs of other stakeholders who are members of the authority comes in. And the final draft then goes to the ministry for its concurrence. With that concurrence, it goes out to the public and to the is notified to the WTO for a 60-day comment period. That comment period really is where anybody can give us inputs. Something like the labeling regulation, which we recently brought out, received thousands of comments. The Ayush Ahar recently also got about close to 300 comments.
These are virtual and physical.
We normally want them online, but some people do want to send it physically. We take these in. Each of these are looked at. See, our basis of our decision making has to be science and the boundaries of that. So they are looked at in case there is any technical fact that we have overlooked, any scientific issue that is new and needs consideration. These are all taken on board. And once we have dealt with all the objections, a revised final regulation comes, and it goes the same route, except that in this route, it also goes through the legislative vetting, and then it is finally published and becomes.
Legislative vetting of.
It goes to the
Ministry
government. They see that the legislative, the structure is all right. Normally it's all right, but it does go through that. And then it becomes a regulation that we then begin to enforce. In most regulations, because you can imagine, it is not possible for us to just put it out and say this takes effect tomorrow. We give almost up to a year before we start enforcing. This is a transition time to industry to change their packaging if they require, to change their product mix if they require, to change the categorization if required, whatever. So this 1 year is provided in the normal course in terms of every regulation. There are very few that, because of emergency reasons, we may operationalize before that. So that's how it happens.
And it's a really, it's a very thorough process, but in that process, there are 2-3 things that I thought would be really interesting for us to hear about. One is the balancing of various interests, because that is critical in thinking through standards. And we're talking about a domain where the 2 big things that I think get talked a lot about when we think about food in India today. One is, what is the pressure from whether it's global trade or interests, that as food gets imported, and there are also international standards and global standards, and how does that get negotiated? How does one approach this question? And the second, which is equally important and much more important in some senses for us, is the fact that this is also a vast informal economy. and the imposition of certain kinds of standards or the bringing in of certain kinds of standards could also have different kinds of commercial and livelihood implications for producers who are in the informal sector. So when one thinks about the approach to making standards, as an authority in India looking at food safety, balancing both this overwhelming informality in the Indian sector, changing dynamics of international trade and global standards. How does FSSAI, approach this, very complex balance?
I think that we sometimes make the mistake of thinking that standards means something that is extremely tough technically to achieve. It is not. In food, it is a question of balance. For instance, in agriculture, when we talk about good agricultural practices, then we say that fertilizer only this much, pesticide only this much. That's good agricultural practice. More than that has repercussions for human health and unnecessary expenditure. So it's a process of really, if I may say, with a large informal economy, that our regulations must be practical, and that is the effort. But they must then be translatable for us in terms of our capacity building initiatives, which we do a lot of, to translate into something that the small businesses can also understand and do. And as far as they're concerned, most of it relates to only hygiene and safe practices. So that is one piece. Yes, there are conflicting pressures. We deal with each one of these because they come as objections, whether they are global, and there's plenty of that. We make an effort. The global standard setting body is the Codex Alimentarius Commission. India has been a member since 1964, and we have been an active member. We had the chairmanship from 2014 to 17. So we have been extremely active in Codex in working with the standard setting process globally. Food Safety Authority is the focal point for India for Codex. So when we look at our own standard setting, we also reference the Codex standard. If it's possible to harmonize, we do it. Particularly in additives and contaminants, we have looked at the risk assessment carried out by JECFA, by the various stakeholders, and we use it. There is no point reinventing it, but we contextualize it to India, to our own context, to our own physiologies.
At this point, I think it would also be very relevant to talk about, despite this entire structure being there, and despite the fact that FSSAI is doing what it can to sort of, plug these holes, there is this huge debate of the GM variety and it seeping in through, because I think pre this discussion, we were having an informal discussion where ma'am explained that how many varieties of GM are officially recognized, and then they do through porous borders or something, they do seep into the country, and FSSAI cannot sort of keep a check and balance on that, because what your scientists are really looking at is something else and not really GM. So would you like to throw some light on that? I think you'd do a better job than I just did.
Well, actually, we'll have to start with the Environment Protection Act.
Right.
Where Section 11 actually says that no genetically modified food shall be imported, processed, brought into the country, except with the consent of the Genetically Engineering Advisory Committee, GEAC. And that's the final body on what should come in. So far, GEAC has not approved any food crop that is genetically modified. So India's position is, whether it is the DGFT regulation and whether it is the Food Safety Authority's position, that GM products are not permitted in this country. But in 2008, the GAC and the Ministry of Environment clarified that processed foods which do not contain, they may be having GM origin ingredients, they may be having GM engineered ingredients, but they do not contain LMOs, no live modified organisms, and therefore they would not be falling under the ambit of Section 11 of the Environment Protection Act and would not be regulated by GAC. Now, in our own act, there is a Section 22 which talks about many categories of product. But when this act was operationalized, it included, I mean, it had genetically modified as one of the categories under Section 22. The Ministry of Health did not notify genetically modified, just that one phrase. The rest of the act got notified. So there now exists a position where GM processed foods should be regulated, should be tested, but there needs to be a regulation in place to do that and to verify that there are no live GMOs on those products. So we have a draft regulation that's under consideration of the government. And the intention there is to not permit any live GM, but GM origin, because there are certain products for which there's no substitute. You look at additives. There are additives which are used in food products. They are originally of GM origin, but there's no live GMO there. And there is no substitute for making certain foods. These products are being imported for use in the drug, the biotechnology industry. But we do not permit them yet for food. So it's important, A, that we understand the boundaries of this and where are the risks for GM products. A recent initiative which we did, and I think that was an important one, was to look at our Environment Protection Act requires that every single crop or product, primary product of GM origin must seek the clearance of the GAC, and GAC normally would reject it because they don't allow. But what if somebody does not ask? Do we check at the points of entry? We do not. So we introduced earlier this year a direction that required all food crops. There are 24 food crops grown anywhere in the world that are of GM origin. Any of these food crops coming from any country to be accompanied by a certificate from a recognized authority of that country saying that the consignment is GM free. It then goes through our regular risk management system at the ports of entry. And that means that about 20% samples will be picked up for testing. And as far as these 24 products are concerned, along with the regular testing, we'll also test for GM free.
So any consignment of these 24 products,
Primary products, they're primary.
coming from countries that are known to have,
No,
or coming from
any country. Because see, globally, the way the foreign trade happens,
Yeah, you can-
transshipment happens, it can go to one port, come from another country. So there is no way to trace the origin of any product 100% with safety. So safety lies that all of them would come with this certificate.
So
And
the process is self-certification, so there is no holdup. But parallelly, there is drawing of samples, subsequent checking, and going back in case there is any violation.
yes, if there's any violation, the consignment gets returned to the port of origin.
I think two very interesting points, you raised. One is to think about risk. And, this is not just on the case of GM, but GM brings it out, that you have to make decisions. We were talking earlier about the temporality. You were saying any penalties on food should be done immediately because there's no point in doing it later. And yet in this space of standard setting, we have to deal with the fact that there is uncertainty, that we often don't have all the information. Science will move fast. And you have to make decisions that could have future consequences given what we know right now. So just the capacity to think about risk and the FSSAI's framework for thinking about risks would be very helpful to understand, because this is an institution that has to actually basically constantly balance and think about
On the
risk.
standards,
Yeah.
there has to be a risk assessment as you start devising the standard. So a scientific risk assessment is an integral part
Yeah.
of what we have to undertake. So this piece is of course inherent. Having said this, I say that knowledge emerges. There is newer and newer knowledge. There is more and more sophistication emerging. And certainly it feeds back into the system and feeds back into the modification of the standards. Food standards are never frozen in time. We try not to change them too often because it is disruptive for the industry. But please also understand that the whole process of standard setting, which I explained, actually takes close to 2 years for the standard to come out. From day one, when we start working on it and going through this entire process and the iteration of, getting in objections and all that, and it goes to the government twice over, the authority twice over, the scientific committee twice over. So it does take that much time. So there is a time frame in which industry adjusts to the idea.
That's really interesting.
Yes, so thank you so much, ma'am. And now I think we're coming to kind of the last segment. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. This has been most interesting. But now I'd like to, bring your attention to the process of licensing and certification. And of course, like you rightly said, the process of standard setting takes so much time, and I'm sure so does the process of licensing and certification. But the idea is that it should take less and less time. Now, I think our audience will be very, very interested in knowing, ma'am, in the long-term vision of the FSSAI pertaining to this area of processes and the vision that FSSAI has for adoption of some of these certification process. A case in point here, and a particularly interesting context that I have is that of Project VOGUE. So VOGUE is an acronym that stands for Blissful Hygienic Offering to Watch. That is an initiative by the FSSAI to encourage religious places to maintain and adopt best practices in manufacturing and handling of the prasadam and other food items. So religious places in the city, especially in Delhi, are being encouraged to go for the VOGUE acronym of the FSSAI, which will eventually lead to the certification of their prasad and langar by the Food Safety Authority. So would you like to take us through these initiatives that FSSAI is taking and maybe some vision that I mentioned earlier?
Can I start with the first part, because that itself is long, and I'll come to VOGUE and similar things in later. See, the first is the compliance part of it, and the issue of how we do, what we look for. The first thing is that anybody in the food business, whether it is a street vendor on the street or the multinational operating out of 2 or 3 geographies, needs to have a license. And or a registration if it's very small. We've tried to align with the GST. So below 20 lakhs annual turnover, you take a registration. And otherwise, you should have a license. And license means a much more thorough inspection, etc. So this is important. And anybody in this business, that means in transport, storage, manufacture, retail, e-commerce, all of them need to take a license. And this first is a method by which you recognize the food business. It's the umbilical connect, if I may, between authority and the regulated entities. The second piece is while we enforce through the states, through the state machinery, we also look much more towards self-compliance. And that means that when a person signs off on that license, he accepts the standards and the code of practice. We have something called Schedule 4, which actually specifies the safety and hygienic practices to be followed by all food businesses. There's different checklists for different categories. So if you're a tiny vendor, it's a much shorter checklist for you. It's a much bigger one for factories or for service establishments. So he signs up that I will be compliant. That is a personal commitment. This gets validated through 3 or 4 ways. One is the traditional way by which we inspect, we take samples and we test. This, of course, is the best way because right then and there, if something's wrong, you can give an improvement notice, take action, all that. But we have in the country at this point in time, 2,500 food safety officers, and we have 46 lakh food businesses. The impossibility of these 2,500 people reaching all of these people is a reality. So that is why we have designed a risk-based system based on the risk and the profile of that food business, how, whether he requires to be visited, whether he requires to be inspected, all that. For the rest, he's supposed to comply. He has several methods. He can go for third-party audits. He could go for, if he's a service establishment, he can go for a hygiene rating. A manufacturer is also required to himself take 2 samples twice a year, get it tested in a laboratory notified by the authority at his cost, and keep those results with him. For the next inspection, he should be able to show that I got these 2 samples tested. So it's a tool to help them. We've also got tools which help people to comply. Codes of practice, do-it-yourself checklist kind of stuff. So this is to help them to be compliant. Our expectation is that industry doesn't willfully go out to follow unsafe practices. I would not think a vendor would really like to harm his client because he would like them to come back to him. So if he knows how to do it, then so be it. And the last tool that we provide for compliance is actually capacity building. We have a very large program for capacity building with about 262 training partners, 2,000 trainers, and 19 programs at basic, intermediate, higher level for all the sectors. It's required that every organization in food business should have at least one person who's trained under the system. We've covered maybe 1.5 to 2 lakh people so far, which is not impressive, but this is the beginning. We intend to do that because this then helps to put in the skilled resources in the food businesses and have a compliant industry.
These talks are, that is why also very important, man, because one thing is to critique a regulator and other things, but the humongous task that a regulator, especially one as far-reaching as FSSAI has. So my next thought and observation on that would be what you just explained, man, coordinating with these state players and state actors in different parts of the country and sort of monitoring them, making sure that your inspectors are doing their job, your other intermediaries are performing and doing what you need them to do, and your stakeholders are self-regulating. Is there something novel that FSSAI plans to do in the near future, or you think the current?
I don't think it's novel. These are practical things we do.
But just on the inspector, I mean, because the food inspector is in some senses almost a legendary figure. It's a historical figure. It's some, you go anywhere, small, and they know who the food inspectors. And as you said, there are not that many of them. But we also know that municipalities, also municipal corporations also have this figure of a food safety officer. So, how this coordination challenge and the capacity challenge, as you say, in some senses, it's a basic role of the state. It's one of the oldest roles. And yet we have, in terms of capacity and numbers, but also then in terms of skill, this is a fair challenge.
So let me say that I do agree with you, and the reputation of FSOs, sometimes needlessly, but sometimes with some foundation, is absolute mud in some places. So we have, again, for them, capacity building programs. So these are mandatory. No FSO can be in the field without that. We've standardized the recruitment rules, so we want only professionally qualified people now as food safety officers. This is now being implemented throughout the country. We have not had so much success with the municipal corporations, where still unqualified people figure in some of the organizations, but otherwise with the state food commissioners, qualified people, trained people. The second is we have brought in inspection tools which are completely transparent online. It's an app, we call it Phosphorus. And you have a provision for geotagging. So when he goes there, you know he's there. He's actually gone. The details of the inspection is only as per checklist. If the checklist is not completed, you go in for 5 minutes and don't do a proper check, you can't upload. So this is one way by which we structure it. The second way by which we structure it is we've created a risk matrix for states of all their food businesses. These 46 lakh licenses are actually all online. It's an online system. So they're already classified according to this. Every FSO gets a printout. These are the 20 guys you need to inspect. And he's supposed to inspect those, except if there is a complaint, you need to inspect that person also. So we are trying to take the subjectivity out of the system, try and bring in some transparency because there's geotagging, there's immediate uploading of the report. And this is getting linked to the online licensing system as we build a history of that food business. So by his own samples, by his tested samples, by his inspection record, by his penalty record, and by his annual returns, we build a history. If I get a safe FPO, his risk profile reduces and his inspection profile improves, sort of. So, I mean, let me say we must use technology because the numbers are so huge that there is no other way to cover this challenge.
So I think just as
I
we
don't think
move-
I've fully answered you, but that's only part of it.
But I think these are, I mean, and also the relationships are complex. So, I mean, you know, inspectors actually are a remarkably studied, under engaged group of people. They do need capacity, you know, and they're very interesting research on different styles of inspection also. And how well do you know the firm that you inspect? What kinds of relationships do you build? So I think our frontline regulatory fieldworking staff don't get the kind of attention that they require, often play very important roles, especially because it is an informal market, it's a complex market.
You know, they work also, I mean, as you see, perhaps police constable,
Yeah.
much reviled figure, but if you see his working conditions,
Yes.
in many cases, they are extremely harsh.
Yes.
For the food safety officers, also in many cases, they do not maybe get a petrol allowance, they may not get adequate support structure, they don't have the tools to keep their samples safe.
Yeah.
So these are issues now that we are addressing. We have created a sample management system, which we've now supplied to 31 states, where we have actually furnished an entire cold chain for preserving the samples, because you take a sample, you're not able to keep it safely. It gets to the lab, it fails. So what was the point of this whole exercise? So this cold chain for the food sampling is also an important piece of this that we are putting in. I think one challenge which perhaps I did not address was the challenge of laboratory capacity as well. Because an important piece of the compliance is to be able to validate compliance. And the validation happens through laboratories. We have a large number of laboratories, primary laboratories, all NABL accredited, or now on the way to being accredited. We have referral laboratories, and we have what we call reference laboratories, which do the proficiency testing, the preparation of reference material, validation of test methods, things like that. So it's a 3-tier system. They're not all government laboratories. Some of them belong to us, very few. A lot belong to the states. A lot belong to the private sector. But some are from research institutions and independent laboratories as well. So they're all part of the system if they choose to be, and they are able to implement the food safety and standards regulations. Now, getting uniform NABL accreditation, getting a comprehensive capacity in each lab, because many of these labs have accreditation, but they can do only a few tests, maybe just the chemical, that kind of stuff. Now, you can't break up a food like that.
Yes.
You got to do the biological, you got to do the physical test. You need to do sometimes the microbiology. So we need the full scope. That is something, again, that is one of our largest investments. Actually, a lot of our budget goes into laboratory capacity strength.
This is just, again, every segment or every topic, right, opens up the complexity. We're also very grateful for the mention of the difficult field conditions. But I think with frontline workers, we really don't pay enough attention and understand the conditions under which they have to operate. There are some really good questions that are also coming in, but in the interest of just moving us along to the final piece is this move and from food safety and adulteration, where we were sitting and discussing the history really emerges, to FSSAI today, which has taken on also the mandate of wholesome food. So it's gone from just safe and an obsession with adulteration almost to now safe and wholesome. And that is a big challenging mandate because it says in the preamble that it is about ensuring the availability of safe and wholesome food. That is a huge challenge, and that is in some senses also shaping of a sector, an entire food system, not a sector at all, like a food system. So it would be really just as a set of concluding thoughts, as the chairperson, as somebody to think about this mandate, and I know there's a big program with Eat Right. How do you see the role of a regulator and a standard setting body in this shaping role when it comes to ensuring the availability of safe and wholesome food? How has it changed how FSSAI has to think about its mandate, the kinds of programs it runs, the sort of awareness, but also, these very challenging, huge debates we're talking about in the backdrop of the UN Food System Summit, big debates on commercialization, on questions of fortification, on accreditation or the inclusion of, say, self-help groups and, street vendors. So there's both in terms of the kinds of food and these debates, as well as in terms of the informality. This question of what kind of food system do we want? Indigenous varieties, the term of millets and a focus on that. So there are all of these questions now facing
so
you.
complex that we will not be able to answer any of the questions. But let me just, I'll be very brief.
Yeah.
Much of, you see, the first 10 years, if I may, we concentrated on the regulations. We had to get the base regulations out. And then we turned to what actually our preamble said, that we need to look at the availability of the wholesome food. A lot of the advocacy we do, I mean, the whole, what is Eat Right? The Eat Right initiative really is an effort to nudge people towards better diets, also to nudge the industry towards rethinking their role as the providers of this nutrition. So many of, and it is, we've done it in a way that is collaborative, certainly, but also by, there's regulatory elements to it, there are capacity building elements to it, there are these certification things like you talked about the book. So there are multiple strands to this effort to actually nudge this behavioral change, both in industry as well as in consumers. So let me talk about how the regulations support this. You mentioned fortification. Well, we didn't have fortification standards. So people were claiming foods were fortified, but there was no standard. What we chose to do was to set standards only for 5 staples. rice, wheat flour, oil, milk, and double fortified salt. And we set those standards at a level of around 30 to 40% of the recommended daily allowance, because our premise was that a diversified diet should bring in the rest. And we will not try and do everything through this. So it was deliberately set at a much lower level. This is the food fortification piece. The second is on trans fats. We brought out a regulation on trans fats. The global goal is that by January 23, the world has to be trans fat free. It's part of the Sustainable Development Goals too. We have planned it for January 1, 22. We started 10 years ago with 10%. We brought it to 5%. We brought it to 3% January of this year, and it's 2% in both oils and fats and processed foods from 1st of January. But what I want to point out is that this nudge business seems to work, because we did a surveillance. We do a lot of surveillance work where you pick up samples which are not regulatory. We did it for the oils and the processed foods to check on trans fats. We found only 2.37% exceeded 3%. That means everybody else was already at 2% level. So we are well on the way to January to meet this goal. Trans fat. And the third area that we focus is on less salt, sugar, fat, food health regulations. These are some of the regulatory ones. The certification issues, we have Eat Right campuses, Eat Right schools. We have Bhog, where we now have already 200 places of worship. These are really clusters, like Clean Street Food Hubs. These are clusters where we bring the vendors, small vendors together, give a little bit of capacity, see that there is a clean water source, hygiene can be maintained, that kind of thing. And what are the protocols for hygiene and things like that. So those certification schemes, which really encourages much more of self-compliance, even by the smallest of small vendors.
So actually, one of our listeners has just said that this is very important information, and who's participating and saying we really should disseminate it widely. And it just strikes me that this is the purpose of this entire series of conversations, that one is those who are participating here, but also being able to share it more widely with students and others who are, and the many, many stakeholders who are interested in and need to understand how FSSAI really works. There are quite a few questions, so should we dive into them?
Yeah. Thanks, Samari. But it's interesting, the nudge part that you spoke about. I don't know if you recall, Nicola, Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize on behavioral economics and who coined the word nudge. The original experiment was American public schools, kids go and have burgers. Now we all know that it's better that they have something quote unquote healthier. But we also don't want to force people to have what we think is healthier. Research revealed that the way you place them in terms of sequence, in terms of how attractive they look, made all the difference. So Thaler and his team went to public schools and found the apple would be kept in a corner. It'll look sad. The burger is kept, nicely. It's the second item or the first item. The colorful plate. It's a young kid running from his football or whatever game, and he's desperate. He goes for the first item. So this is repositioned, presented it better, and there's some 60–70% increase in the quantum of apple consumed pre and post. So this is the example he starts with in nudge. So it's very heartening to see.
I'm going to answer questions because there's something to say on this, but I don't want to say it.
No, please say, do say.
What I wanted to say is that in order to do this, it's not quite, it's a complex thing. When we're looking at school children, what are we doing? We are looking at curriculums to just insert the idea of food, what's healthy, what should you eat? That's one. Two, lots of competitions in these Eat Right schools on kids competing with painting competitions and writing and essays and speaking on good, right food. No advertising. We don't permit any food company to even have a hoarding within 50 yards or sell any of these so-called sin products within 50 yards of the school, but also not to sponsor any competitions in the school because it becomes an indirect promotion. So that regulation, you could say draconian, but in a sense, it's an effort to change the what may I say, the mindset of kids at a young age and teach them also, because we are bringing in what we call the food safety magic box. Simple tests. There are about 100 tests in that little box. You can check whether there is water in the milk. You can check whether there is something else in the haldi. So simple little tests that kids can do. Kids as young as 8 years old. It comes with a little manual. We hand it over to schools. And so children become aware of what is safety also. Not just what's healthy, but what's safe also. How do you keep it safe? And
in both of these examples, both this question of not letting the hoardings in or food being sold or not using this as a marketing opportunity for certain kinds of food, there's a conflict of interest. But also in your example about, say, capacity building for small businesses and vendors, there is an understanding, at least I can see, to have a diverse food system where small and large can also exist. And this is not something that's easy to ensure because the whole process of formalization often excludes. And I think, at least from what I'm understanding, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, there seems to be a very conscious effort to engage the Indian economy and the food economy as it exists. And the Indian, it seems, and that's important to hear and important for us to understand that that's an effort and how does that get strengthened? Because there are, of course, very many competing interests in this space and commercial interests that we need to understand. So, it links to one of the questions that's from Praveen Ravi, which is actually on market failure. And I think here, because he's moving towards, does FSSAI conduct assessments of impact of its regulation on market outcomes? I think when we're thinking about market outcomes here, we're talking a little bit about competition also. So market failures in the kinds of ways, at least that's how I understand the question, which is given a regulator's role of identifying and addressing market failures, and given such failures have very different across food category segments, does FSSAI have a structure to focus its resources on areas where market failures are highest? And I'm thinking market failure here is also about competition, asymmetries of information. And that is not, FSSAI's role in vis-a-vis thinking about market outcomes and competition. It's important to clarify.
I think very clearly this is not our role. Our focus is on the safety and quality. And as you very rightly put it, we are not here to change the way Indians prepare their food and eat it. Our focus is to ensure that we can make those very context safe and hygienic and palatable for all Indians. So we use that context. All our surveys are focused on either assessing compliance to standards, that's the surveillance, or the dietary surveys, which we are now doing a massive national dietary survey to try and understand how diets are changing and whether we can find on regional basis a different color to those changes, which could be linked to the disease profile. Because if you look at non-communicable disease, and now there is a WHO study and I think ICMR as well, 6 out of 10 causes of death are related to something related to food or to drinking water. So this is a huge, if 60% of deaths must be linked, placed at the door of something related to diets, then we have to find out what's happening.
So ma'am, would you say then, and I think this is also where the question is coming, since we know that standards are often in many countries, certainly with phytosanitary conditions and others, now often thought of as non-tariff barriers.
Indeed.
Where is the competition problem, right, or the composition problem, something that, say, a competition regulator, CCI, has to look at? And obviously it's important to you because the small actor is also important,
Yes.
and who is included and excluded from the market. But is that, are you saying in some senses there's a separation here, that the issue will be taken up? It is an important matter, but it is not for FSSAI.
Indeed.
Yeah, that's really clarifying. There are questions around GM. I think one is a very interesting question, has a bigger implications. Harish Damodaran is asking, how is GM soybean meal used in making poultry and animal feed, not food? So this feed, not food. And so what gets counted as food? So I think Harish goes further and says the chicken and eggs I'm eating now are from broilers and layer birds fed on GM ingredients. Then since the food eventually consumed has, feed as an input, how do you, this ambit of what is food then?
Okay, very clearly at this point, animal feed is not within the mandate of the Food Safety Authority. The proposed amendment to the Act chooses to ask for it to be included in, for the simple reason that contaminants, as we have seen in dairy, for instance, aflatoxins flowing from feed into the actual milk product. So yes, today animal feed is not regulated by the Food Safety Authority, but we do mandate that no food shall be brought onto the market unless the feed that has been given to that particular livestock is compliant with at least the BIS standards. We've issued a direction to that effect. So that's one. The second is, as far as the soybean meal is concerned, it does not contain live GMO. Soybean meal, a large consignment came in recently for the poultry, and we were asked to clear it, and we said we can't, it's not in our scope. But it went to GAC, and GAC ruled that there is no live GMO in soya meal because it has been processed. So it is completely safe, and so it has come in. So there is no risk of contamination due to soya meal.
Right. So a linked question on GMO, since we're on it, is from Azid Mikonen, who asks, what are your views on the recent GMO rice alert in the EU originating from India?
Look, I think the Department of Commerce has already said that this is a one-off. Nevertheless, as a regulator, I would say that even one-off would be a cause for us to be concerned. We need to trace it back, and we need to find out if this has been as a consequence of a leakage from a field trial. If so, whether our containment measures are adequate, and what are the safety measures that we can put in place. Because while field trials will have to happen, this is a part of science and a part of development, but we will need to ensure these are perfectly constrained and precautions that are mandated are taken. Because we are a major agricultural exporter, and we cannot afford to have our credibility dented in any fashion.
Thank you, ma'am. We have a question from Sonia Singh from TIS, and she says that last year, Center for Science and Environment came up with a report accusing a top brand of selling adulterated honey, while these companies were advertising false claims of these products being pure and healthy, and I'm sure there are many more such examples. So she's asking, what is the process of taking action against such incidents as a food regulatory body? Are there any guidelines for regulating fallacious food product advertisements? This is, I think, a very misleading advertisements. And I think that is the area we're getting into.
So if we are talking about advertisements, and there is a regulation that governs labeling and advertisement. And any such misleading advertisement or misleading claim is punishable under the Act itself. So that is one. On the study done by the CSC, in fact, they brought that to us and we thanked them because they actually identified a vulnerable area. Technically, this has happened because, see, sugar contains natural sucrose and glucose. Now, if I add more sucrose and glucose to the same honey, then it is very difficult in laboratory testing to be able to tell what I've done. So it is a complex testing challenge. Our testing panel was actually given this entire case study, and we have further tightened our testing methodology. We've also taken up drives across the country and at honey factories across the country to sample and test. We took it very seriously. Any such information that comes to us from an NGO, from any source, which is validated, scientifically established, we take it extremely seriously.
And in such cases, self-regulation is not something that can be then called upon to say that, well, this industry or this particular manufacturer did not comply with certain self-regulatory mechanisms. That
See, what happens, like in all large sectors, what happens is the producers are very small producers who produce small volumes. Now, then comes an aggregator who brings it together. He have collected honey from 400 farms. He aggregates that honey and sells it to a large company who then does some cleaning process, packages it and sells it under their own label. So the issue of traceability in agricultural produce becomes extremely critical. And these traceability networks is something that we need to establish. And in fact, this is something that we requested the Ministry of Agriculture to bring in as far as honey is concerned, because it's a very, very real challenge. And it's difficult otherwise to identify where that honey came from.
We're reaching the close, and I think we're done great for time. A comment has just come in from Tariq Ahmed Butt, says his many thanks to you for such a comprehensive conversation, which covered all these aspects of food safety with so many, with the latest information and clarifications. And I think we all join in that thanks, that it was just a really comprehensive and complex conversation. But maybe as a final comment, to ask you about your own learning curve. Coming into this, because you've shared with us so many details, and much of it is technical and it is shifting and changing. And as the chairperson, how you have in a sense had to learn, and the process of and you said also bringing in backgrounds to this role, including previous positions in health and in other contexts. So to just be how you think you sort of
I have to tell you that I started with a little bit of an advantage, because 15 years ago, I was responsible for the implementation of the PFA Act in the Health Ministry. So I have a context for food safety. The second has been, of course, my experience in the Ministry of Commerce, because agriculture being such a significant element of our and sensitive element of our exports, was something we grappled with, and we have our own agencies like EIC and APIDA and Coffee Board, Tea Board, all those, MPIDA as part of. So we were dealing with agriculture and particularly the sanitary, phytosanitary issues related around agricultural trade. It's one of the most significant issues in the WTO still. So that was my context, and it has been a reason that I have also during this tenure concentrated on strengthening the import regulatory system, which I believe now is fairly robust and comparable to many other countries. But yes, this is a brand new act, and I have learned something new every day. When I came in here, I used to actually go and sit in on every scientific panel's meetings so that I could get a sense of what was going on, how the standard setting process happened, where the data came in from, how the contribution flowed in. So I think I spent the first 7 or 8 months just sitting as a silent observer in every scientific panel. And I learned. And frankly, my colleagues have taught me every single day.
It's amazing. A brand new act for a brave new world. So we're in really that territory. But thank you so much, Abha, Dr. Krishnan.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, ma'am. It's really been a privilege, because if the idea was demystify regulators and demystify this one particular regulator, clearly, I think we are beginning to succeed. But we are beginning to succeed because you're willing to speak. You're willing to speak and answer questions which vary from sort of one end of the constitutional aspects of an agency to minor details of what constitutes milk, how does one regulate prasad. So the fascinating world of regulators is something that you've thrown a lot of light on. Thanks again, ma'am. And in particular, I think the aspect emphasizing, I think a very important aspect of cultures of organizations. You know, in government, we don't actually spend sufficient time thinking about it, working about it. And you clearly, I think I heard you say, it's taken a while, because that part is history. It's not something anyone can undo. And if you have a large organization, you can't disinherit it, but shaping it to the new objectives and amalgamating organizations that have come with different cultures is something which is important. That very nuanced point that you made about judicial powers, but being exercised in a sort of graded manner, and the reference to appellate bodies which are different for different kinds of misdemeanors, violations, is something which is interesting. And the international dimension without disrupting trade and commerce, and in a sense, moving from self-certification, but having the ability to go back, verify a sample, and without doing damage, contain, get back, and sort of sort out issues. These are all on the general lessons on regulatory sort of architectures and sphere. And clearly, of course, a lot of very material, important, useful stuff on the content of the regulation itself. I think all in all, a very fascinating evening conversation. But once again, ma'am, on behalf of all our institutions, on behalf of FOIR and on behalf of the audience, thanks very much. Greatly enjoyed being there.
Thank
Really
you. I
appreciate
enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.